The 1970s were a different era of American eating. Some of what people cooked and consumed back then has since been banned by federal law, restricted by wildlife protection acts, or flagged as a food safety violation carrying real criminal penalties. This is not nostalgia. This is the story of how dramatically American food law changed in one generation. Here is what was perfectly normal on American dinner tables in the 1970s, and what would get you arrested, fined, or shut down today. Blackened Gulf redfish. When Louisiana chef Paul Prudhomme unveiled his blackened redfish recipe in the late 1970s, the result was one of the most consequential food crazes in American history. The dish was extraordinary. Redfish fillets scorched in a cast-iron skillet at high heat with a heavy coating of Cajun spices, the outside going black and smoky, while the inside stayed moist and sweet. Restaurant owners across the country added it to their menus the moment they heard about it. Home cooks bought cast-iron skillets specifically to recreate it. The problem was that everyone wanted it at the same time. The popularity of blackened redfish had devastating consequences. By the mid-1980s, redfish populations in the Gulf of Mexico had plummeted to dangerous levels due to overfishing. The fish simply could not reproduce fast enough to keep up with the demand the recipe had created in a matter of years. In 1987, commercial harvesting of redfish was banned in federal waters. States implemented their own catch limits. Today, while recreational fishing of redfish is allowed in some areas with strict catch limits, the commercial sale of wild-caught Gulf redfish remains largely illegal. The dish that made Paul Prudhomme famous is the dish that made commercial Gulf redfish illegal. One recipe, one decade, an entire industry shut down. Tiger meat sandwiches. The name sounds alarming, and the reality was only slightly less so. Tiger meat was a Midwestern specialty, a sandwich spread made from raw ground beef seasoned with onion, salt, and pepper, sometimes mixed with raw egg, spread on rye bread or crackers, and served at parties and family gatherings as a perfectly ordinary appetizer. It was particularly popular in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, where German and Scandinavian immigrant communities had long traditions of eating raw or lightly cured meat preparations. Tiger meat sat on party tables next to deviled eggs and cheese balls through most of the 1970s, without anyone thinking twice about it. The USDA and FDA now strongly advise against consuming raw ground beef due to the risk of E. coli 0157:H7, a strain that was not even identified until 1982. Before that identification, nobody had connected raw ground beef to the severe illness and kidney failure it could cause, particularly in children. Health departments would now shut down any establishment serving it. Offering it at a public event could result in legal liability that would end a food business permanently. What sat on party tables in 1975 is now a food safety violation. Sea turtle soup. Through much of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, sea turtle soup appeared on menus at upscale coastal restaurants and in specialty markets near port cities. Green sea turtle in particular was considered a delicacy. The rich, dark meat produced a dense, savory broth that chefs and food writers of the era described as something between beef consommé and the finest oxtail soup. It was expensive. It was prestigious. It was the kind of dish that appeared at formal dinners where impression mattered. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 began to change the legal landscape, though enforcement took years to become consistent. By the early 1980s, all sea turtle species were fully protected under both domestic law and international agreement. Today, hunting, possessing, or consuming sea turtle meat or eggs carries federal criminal penalties, including substantial fines and potential imprisonment. The dish that represented fine dining sophistication in 1970 is now classified as wildlife crime. The restaurants that served it are long closed. The waters that once supplied them are patrolled by federal wildlife officers. Whale meat. Whale meat was not part of everyday American cooking in the 1970s, but it was legally available in some coastal markets, particularly in areas with historical whaling traditions or significant populations of immigrants from Japan, Norway, and Iceland, nations where whale consumption had deep cultural roots. It appeared occasionally in specialty stores and was sold as red meat with a flavor somewhere between beef and venison. The Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 fundamentally changed what was permitted in American waters. The commercial whaling moratorium implemented by the International Whaling Commission in 1986 extended those protections globally. Today, possessing or selling whale meat in the United States is a serious federal offense. Raw milk and farmhouse dairy. In rural America through the 1970s, raw, unpasteurized milk was simply what dairy was. Families with their own cows drank what the cow produced. Neighbors bought directly from nearby farms without the transaction passing through any regulatory framework. The idea that milk required processing before it was safe to drink would have seemed strange to a significant portion of the American population. Small local cheesemakers produced wheels and rounds from raw milk and sold them at farm stands and local stores without laboratory testing or aging requirements. The cheeses had flavors and textures that pasteurized milk versions could not fully replicate. Sharper, more complex, more directly connected to what the animals had eaten. The FDA now prohibits interstate sale of raw milk for human consumption entirely. Individual states vary in what local raw milk sales they permit, but the regulations are strict and enforcement is real. The casual farm-to-neighbor dairy transactions that were entirely normal in rural communities throughout the 1970s would today require licensing, testing, and compliance documentation that most small farmers cannot practically obtain. The milk your grandparents bought directly from a neighbor's barn is now a federal contraband item the moment it crosses a state line. Home distilled spirits. In certain parts of rural America, particularly in Appalachia and the rural South, home distilling was a tradition that stretched back before the country itself existed. Through the 1970s, backyard stills and mason jars of homemade, high-proof spirits existed in a practical gray zone where federal law technically prohibited them, but enforcement was sporadic and community tolerance was high. Federal law on this point has not changed. It has simply been enforced with much greater consistency. Producing distilled spirits without a federal distilled spirits permit is a felony offense carrying potential prison time of up to 5 years and substantial financial penalties. The IRS and the TTB take unlicensed alcohol production seriously in a way that rural enforcement patterns in the 1970s did not always reflect. Home beer brewing and winemaking were legalized for personal use in 1978. Home distilling was not included in that liberalization and remains a federal crime regardless of the quantity produced or whether any sale is involved. The mason jar passed between neighbors in 1974 was illegal then. It is still illegal now. The difference is what happens when you get caught. Sassafras root tea. Sassafras tea, brewed from the roots and bark of the sassafras tree, was a traditional folk beverage with centuries of American history behind it, particularly in southern and Appalachian communities where it was used as a spring tonic and everyday drink. The roots were dug in early spring when the sap was running, dried, and steeped in hot water to produce a reddish-orange tea with a distinctive flavor that tasted like the original source of root beer, because it was. The FDA prohibited sassafras root and its oil for food use in 1960, with fuller enforcement arriving through the 1970s, after research demonstrated that safrole, the primary aromatic compound in sassafras oil, produced liver tumors in laboratory rats at high doses. Commercial production ended. Traditional home use continued informally in communities where the practice was deeply embedded. Today, selling sassafras root or any product containing safrole for consumption violates FDA regulations. The commercially available sassafras flavoring that appears in some root beer and candy production has had the safrole removed. It is chemically a different product from the root itself. The spring ritual of digging sassafras roots that some grandmothers maintained through the 1970s is now a regulatory violation if those roots are sold or commercially distributed. Roadkill recovery. Waste not, want not was a practical philosophy in rural American households through the 1970s, and that philosophy extended to the edges of country roads after deer season or any time of year when an animal met a vehicle on a rural highway. Recovering usable meat from road-killed deer, rabbits, and other animals was not unusual in communities where food was not taken for granted, and a freezer full of meat had real economic value. The legal status of this practice was rarely examined at the time. Wildlife regulations focused primarily on hunting seasons and bag limits, and the recovery of animals already dead from vehicle strikes existed in a largely unaddressed space. That space is now addressed in most states, and the answers vary dramatically. Some states have passed explicit roadkill salvage laws that permit recovery under specific conditions, usually requiring a permit obtained within a short time window and reporting the incident to wildlife authorities. Unregulated wild mushroom sales. The Back to the Land movement of the early 1970s brought a significant revival of interest in foraging, and wild mushrooms were among the most sought-after finds. Amateur and experienced foragers alike gathered chanterelles, morels, chicken of the woods, and dozens of other edible species, and incorporated them into home cooking, shared them with friends, and sometimes sold or traded them through informal local markets, including community markets and direct sales to small restaurants. Regulatory oversight of wild mushroom sales was minimal through most of this period. The expertise required to identify edible mushrooms safely was considered a personal responsibility rather than a subject for government certification. Commercial sale of wild foraged mushrooms now requires expert identification verification and health department compliance in most states. Restaurant use of foraged mushrooms faces particularly strict oversight. While personal foraging for home consumption remains legal everywhere, the informal selling and public serving of wild mushrooms that occurred naturally within the back-to-the-land communities of the 1970s would now trigger food safety investigations in most jurisdictions. The difference between a morel and a deadly look-alike can be subtle enough that regulators have decided the risk is not one the public should be asked to assess in a commercial transaction. Imported haggis. Scottish-American families in the 1970s who wanted authentic haggis for Burns Night or other occasions could still obtain it. The traditional preparation of sheep offal mixed with oatmeal and spices, cooked inside a sheep's stomach, imported directly from Scotland and available through specialty importers serving immigrant communities. The USDA banned the use of livestock lungs in food products intended for human consumption in 1971. The ban on importing haggis containing sheep lungs followed as an enforcement matter. Authentic, traditional Scottish haggis, which requires lung meat as a primary ingredient, cannot legally enter the United States. Customs and Border Protection will seize it. American-made haggis prepared without lung meat is available and legal. Scottish haggis producers and expatriate communities maintain that it is not the same product. The technical argument is correct. The ingredient profile is different, and the result tastes different. The haggis that appeared on Scottish-American tables in 1975 is now contraband at the airport. Raw oysters in summer. Oyster bars operated year-round through the 1970s without significant regulatory distinction between seasons. The old guideline about avoiding oysters in months without the letter R, a traditional European rule dating to the era before refrigeration, was treated as a suggestion rather than a safety framework, and as refrigeration improved and transportation accelerated, many consumers ignored it entirely. Vibrio vulnificus, a naturally occurring marine bacterium that thrives in warm water and accumulates in filter-feeding shellfish during summer months, causes severe and potentially fatal illness in people with liver conditions or compromised immune systems. The regulatory response to documented illness clusters led to rules that now govern when and how raw oysters from Gulf Coast waters can legally be sold. Some states prohibit the sale of untreated raw Gulf oysters during warm months entirely. Others require that they undergo post-harvest processing, a treatment that kills Vibrio bacteria but alters the texture and flavor in ways that raw oyster enthusiasts consider significant. The casual summer raw oyster service that operated without seasonal restriction through the 1970s would now require compliance documentation that some operators cannot or will not provide. Homemade products sold without inspection. The informal economy of homemade food products sold at roadside stands, local markets, and through neighborhood networks was a significant part of rural and small-town American commerce through the 1970s. Canned goods, cured meats, baked goods, fermented foods, and dairy products moved between neighbors and into informal commercial channels without the inspection, licensing, or laboratory testing that commercial food production now requires. Many states now have cottage food laws that permit limited home-based food production for direct sale, but these laws vary dramatically in what products they allow, what revenue limits they impose, and what labeling requirements they create. Low-acid canned goods, vegetables, meats, and soups are excluded from cottage food exemptions in virtually every state because the risk of botulism contamination in improperly processed canned goods is severe and the required processing equipment is specialized. Canned horse meat for human consumption. Horse meat appeared in American grocery stores through the early 1970s in canned form, marketed under brand names that deliberately obscured what the product actually was. It was inexpensive, shelf-stable, and nutritionally comparable to beef. Some families purchased it as a budget protein source without examining the label too carefully. Others bought it knowingly as an alternative to more expensive cuts. The practice never achieved mainstream acceptance in American food culture the way it had in France, Belgium, and parts of Central Asia, but it existed in the market without federal prohibition. Specialty butchers in some cities carried fresh horse meat for customers from European immigrant communities where consumption was culturally normal. The effective end came through a congressional funding mechanism rather than an outright ban. In 2007, Congress defunded federal inspection of horse slaughter facilities, making it practically impossible to process horse meat for human consumption under the USDA oversight that commercial meat sales require. Though this provision has lapsed and been reinstated at various points, no operational horse slaughter facility for human consumption has functioned in the United States for years. Individual states have added their own explicit prohibitions. The canned product that sat on grocery shelves in 1972 has no legal path to American store shelves today. Pufferfish served without certification. In the 1970s, as Japanese immigration increased and Japanese restaurants began appearing in American cities, fugu, pufferfish, occasionally appeared on menus in its raw sashimi form, without the strict handling requirements that Japan itself had imposed on its own restaurants since the early 20th century. The fish contains tetrodotoxin in its organs, a neurotoxin for which there is no antidote and which has caused documented fatalities. The FDA now prohibits the import of pufferfish from Japanese suppliers unless it has been cleaned and processed by certified handlers at approved facilities. Restaurants wishing to serve fugu must comply with state regulations that in most jurisdictions require extensive documentation of the supply chain, and in some states prohibit service entirely, regardless of chef certification. The informal service of fugu that occurred in some early Japanese-American restaurants in the 1970s, where the knowledge of individual chefs was assumed to be sufficient protection without regulatory oversight, would now trigger enforcement action in virtually every American jurisdiction. The fish itself has not changed. What changed is the formal acknowledgement that a single preparation error kills the person who eats it, and that the government has a responsibility to regulate that risk. Wild-caught striped bass sold commercially. Striped bass were abundant along the Atlantic coast through much of American history, and commercial fishing of them was a significant industry through the 1970s. Fish markets in coastal cities from Maine to the Carolinas sold fresh-caught striped bass as a routine item. Not a delicacy, not a specialty, just a common fish that appeared on weeknight dinner tables at prices families could manage. The population collapsed. Overfishing combined with habitat degradation drove Atlantic striped bass numbers down so severely that by the early 1980s, the fishery was in crisis. The Atlantic Striped Bass Conservation Act of 1984 imposed a federal framework for management. States along the Atlantic coast implemented strict catch limits and, in some cases, temporary commercial fishing moratoriums. Commercial sale of wild-caught Atlantic striped bass remains tightly regulated today, with strict quotas, size limits, and seasonal restrictions governing what can legally be sold. The open commercial market that supplied fish markets in 1972 no longer exists in anything like its former form. The striped bass on a 1970s dinner table was caught and sold without the paperwork, permits, and quota compliance that the same fish would require today. Homemade wine served at public events without licensing. Home winemaking existed in a legally ambiguous space through much of the 20th century. When federal law was amended in 1978 to permit home production of beer and wine for personal use, up to 200 gallons per household annually, it clarified something that had been practiced widely but technically violated federal law since Prohibition ended. What the 1978 amendment did not do was legalize serving homemade wine at public events, selling it, or distributing it beyond personal and family consumption. Through the 1970s, community events, church fundraisers, ethnic cultural festivals, and neighborhood gatherings frequently featured homemade wine produced by community members. Certain imported cheeses with unpermitted additives. Through the 1970s, a wider variety of imported cheeses entered the United States through specialty importers, ethnic grocery stores, and the growing number of gourmet food shops that served urban food enthusiasts. Some of these cheeses contained additives, colorings, or preservation methods that had not been evaluated by the FDA under the regulatory framework that governed domestic food production. The FDA's Import Alert System now flags specific products and producers from foreign countries when their products have been found to violate American food additive safety or labeling standards. Products on Import Alert are subject to automatic detention at the border. They are stopped and held without physical examination, required to trigger enforcement. Some specific traditional European cheese preparations that circulated through specialty import channels in the 1970s would today be detained at the border, returned to origin, or destroyed. The cheese on a 1970s gourmet shop shelf sometimes arrived because nobody looked closely at what was in it. Today, someone looks. Saccharin in unrestricted quantities. Saccharin, the pink packet artificial sweetener that sat in diners and home kitchens through the 1970s as the primary sugar substitute available to diabetics and dieters, nearly disappeared from the American market entirely at the end of the decade. In 1977, the FDA proposed an outright ban on saccharin after a Canadian study demonstrated that extremely high doses caused bladder tumors in rats. The proposal triggered one of the largest public responses to a regulatory action in FDA history. Diabetics and consumer groups flooded Congress with letters arguing that the risks of sugar were more concrete and immediate than the theoretical risks of saccharin at the doses humans actually consumed. Congress responded by passing the Saccharin Study and Labeling Act, which placed a moratorium on the ban and instead required warning labels. The Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources implemented management measures that required catch documentation schemes, catch limits, and vessel monitoring. The United States enacted the Patagonian toothfish importation provisions, requiring that any Chilean sea bass imported into the country be accompanied by documentation certifying legal and regulated catch. The fish sold without documentation through the informal seafood channels of the 1970s would today be subject to import seizure. The paperwork requirement exists because the alternative was watching the species disappear from the waters it came from, which was happening on a documented and measurable timeline. The America of the 1970s ate freely in ways that seem remarkable now. Not because people were reckless, but because the consequences of certain food practices had not yet been fully understood or documented, because regulatory agencies had not yet built the enforcement capacity they later developed, and because many of the species that ended up protected by federal law were still abundant enough that protection felt unnecessary.